I'm going to recreate this HR dashboard from start to finish in Tableau. I'll walk through how to build custom charts, design a clean layout, and add polished visuals. So let's start on a blank workbook, and I'll hit Connect to Data and use an Excel file. The Excel file I'm choosing is linked in the description and contains some HR data. It contains these 3 different sheets, but I'm going to start by dragging in the totals sheet. You can see this just contains the year and quarter, the actual number of people, and the target number of people. Instead of starting off on a worksheet, I'm going to start off by creating a new dashboard for the background. I'll start by changing the object settings to floating and the size of the dashboard to 1300 by 800. Then under Objects, I'll drag in an image and choose this background I created in Canva. And at the end of this video, I'll show how quick and easy it is to create this background in Canva. Using the Layout tab, I'll set the position to 0, 0, and the size to match the size of the dashboard. Since this gray box kind of pops out, I'm going to use it for the most important data, which is the number of employees versus the target. So I'll start off on this new worksheet to build a visual that compares actuals and the targets using this totals data source. And I want this to be a trend over time, so I'll start by dragging the year quarter field into the columns. Then I'll bring actuals into the row and target into the row as well. That way we get 2 different marks. Under all, I'm going to change both of these to align. Then I'll right-click on one of our measures to make this a dual axis. And I'll right-click on the axis to synchronize them. I'll right-click again to edit the axis and uncheck Include 0. That way we can see more of the variation with the actual lines. Then under the All marks, I'm going to remove the measure name coloring. And for the first mark, I'm going to change the color of this line to white. For the second mark, I'm going to change the color of this to light blue. Then under Path, I'm going to choose the dotted line. Using the size sliders in the marks, I'm going to increase the size of both of these lines. I chose to make the light blue line dotted because it represents the targeted headcount, and the white line solid because it represents the actual headcount. For formatting, I'll start by removing both the headers. Then I'll format the worksheet, and under shading, I'll remove the shading of the worksheet. For borders, I'll remove the row and column divider. And for lines, I'll remove the row grid lines. And now we're left with just a high-level view of the trend. On the dashboard, I'll bring in this actuals versus target worksheet. I'll hide the title of the worksheet and resize it so it fits in this box. When users hover over, they can see the values for each quarter. And I left these details out of the visual itself to keep it high level, so users can see the overall trend at a glance. But it would also be useful to include a legend to show what the trend lines represent. So on a new worksheet, I'm going to show how to create a legend with solid and dotted lines. I'll start by moving measure names into the rows and the measure values into the marks. Then I'll remove totals, so I'm just looking at actuals and the target. To make this legend fully customizable, I'm going to type 0 twice into the columns. That way we get 2 marks to work with. And the first mark is going to represent the lines, so I'll change the mark type to a shape. Then I'll move measure names in to determine the shape. Using the legend, I'll edit the shapes, and I'll use this custom shape palette that I loaded in, but I have another video on how to do that. I created these images in Canva, a solid white line for actuals and a dotted blue line for the target. This makes them fully customizable because you can adjust the color, the line width, and even the dot spacing. Then I'll use the size slider in the first mark to increase the size of these lines. The second mark will be for our labels, so I'm going to change the mark type to text. I'll pull measure names in and make this text. Then I'll pull measure names in again and make this a color. Using the legend, I'll edit the colors, and for actual, I'm going to choose white to match our line. And for target, I'm going to choose that same light blue color to match our dotted line. Then using text within the mark, I'll edit the text and change the font type to Tableau Bold and the size to 12. And to make the formatting a little bit easier, I'm just going to right-click on our trend worksheet and copy the formatting. Then I'll right-click on our legend worksheet and paste the formatting. Now to get rid of the other lines, I'll right-click Format on the worksheet, and for lines, I'll remove the 0 lines for the sheet, and under columns, I'll remove the grid lines. And we don't need this header anymore, so I'm going to remove it. Then on our dashboard, I'll add our Trend Legend worksheet. I'll hide the title of the worksheet and set this to the entire view. Then I'll resize it so it fits in our box. Now we have a clear view of the headcount trend, comparing actuals and targets over time. The legend makes it easy to tell them apart, with a solid line for actuals representing real data, and a dotted line for targets which serves as a reference point. This makes the comparison easy to interpret at a glance. And since this is high level, I also want to add the number of current employees. To do this, I'm actually going to use the data source that I'm going to use for the rest of the dashboard. So I'll go to the Data tab at the top and hit New Data Source. I'll use Excel and choose that same HR data file, but this time I'm going to bring in the employee data sheet. This includes each employee's ID along with some details about them. On a new worksheet, I'm going to start off by just capturing the total number of active employees. I'll start by dragging employee ID into the marks. Then I'll right-click, go to Measure, and choose Count Distinct. Then I'll make this measure text. Within text under the marks, I'm going to hit Edit, and above the number of employees, I'll type the text Active Employees. Then I'll select everything so I can change it to Tableau Bold, and I'll set the color to white. For the title, I'll change this to size 15, and I'll make the actual number of employees larger so it stands out. Then on the dashboard, I'll add our new worksheet. I'll quickly format the worksheet to remove the shading so we can see the white text against the dark gray box. Then I'll set this to fill the entire view. I'll hide the title of the worksheet and resize it so that it's in the empty space in the box. Then I'll format the worksheet again just so I can align the text in the center. This visual tracks active employees over time, comparing the actual number represented by the solid white line to the targeted number, which is the dotted blue line. It gives a clear at-a-glance view of workforce trends and any gaps between actuals and targets. The rest of the visuals for this HR dashboard will use the employee data source, starting with a breakdown of employees by work arrangement type. To represent the 3 types of work arrangements, I'm going to build a pie chart using a hexagon to show you can really use any shape for pie charts. They don't have to be circles. To do this, I'll start with the basic structure of a pie chart by adding the site field to the marks. Then I'll add our employee ID field, right-click, go to Measure, and choose Count Distinct. For the mark type, I'll select a pie, and I want site to determine the color of each slice of the pie, and the number of employees to determine the angles of the pie. Then in the rows, I'll type 0 twice. I'll right-click on one of these and make them a dual axis. And we're going to use this second mark to get that hexagon shape. So I'm going to remove everything that's currently in there. Then I'll change the mark type from a pie to a shape. And under Shape, I'll hit More Shapes. And I'll choose this custom shape palette that I loaded in here. I created this image in Canva, and I'll include the link in the description. But this is super easy to make, and you can do it with any shape. This is just a hexagon with a white border and a transparent center. When I increase the size of the hexagon, it overlaps part of the pie chart, leaving behind a pie chart shaped like a hexagon. And I'm just going to increase the size a little more to fit the entire view. Then for the pie chart, I'll adjust the size to get that hexagon shape back. For formatting, I'll start by removing the header. Then I'll format the worksheet, and for shading, I'll choose None. For borders, I'll remove the row and column dividers. And for lines, I'll remove the 0 lines and the row grid lines. Then I'll remove the other header. I'm also going to right-click on Site so I can sort it. I'll choose to sort by a field, and I'll choose the employee ID and the count distinct. Then I'll sort these in descending order so it starts with the site with the most employees. I'll edit the colors using the legend, and I'm just going to use these blue colors for the different sites. but I also want to add a legend that has some details about the site types. So on a new worksheet, I'll create a site legend. I'll start by moving site into the columns, and then I'll type 0 into the rows. I'll change the mark type to a shape. Then under shape, I'll choose more shapes. And so that it matches our hexagon theme, I'm going to make this a hexagon shape. Then I'll move site into the marks and make this the label. I'll also type the count distinct of the employee IDs and make this a label as well. And I want to sort these the same way I did for the hexagon pie chart. I'll sort by field, choose the employee ID, the count distinct, and put them in descending order. Next, I'll move site into the marks and make this a color. That way I can edit the colors using the legend and choose the same colors I did for the pie chart. So this worksheet's not only acting as a legend for the hexagon-shaped pie chart, but it's also giving more details about the sites, like the exact number of active employees for each site. For formatting, I'll start by hiding the header. Then I'll format the worksheet, and for shading, I'll choose none. For lines, I'll remove the 0 lines and the axis rulers. Then under rows, I'll remove the grid lines. And I'll remove this header we have on the left as well. That way we're left with just our legend. Using label within the marks, I'm going to edit the text. And this is what I love about creating these custom legends. You can not only add more information to the legend, but you can also fully customize the look of it. So now we have a horizontal legend that uses hexagons instead of the traditional squares. And I just added the number of employees for each site, but you can add as many measures as you want in here. On a dashboard, I'll start by bringing in our site worksheet. I'll hide the title of the worksheet and then resize this. And we don't need this legend anymore because we've created our own. So I'm going to add the site legend worksheet, hide the title, and resize it. And I'll get rid of this legend as well. When I go back to the site legend worksheet and increase the size of the hexagons, you can see how they can overlap with the text. To fix this, I'm going to bring back our sum of 0 header. Then I'll edit the axis to give it a custom fixed range between -2 and 1. This effectively moves all the objects up so that the hexagon is no longer in the center of the worksheet, but instead the hexagon and text are centered. I also want to label this visual, so I'm going to drag in a text object and type work arrangement. Then I'll format the text to change the font, set it to size 14, and make the color black. Then I'll position this so it's above our work arrangement visuals. I'm also going to make the text centered horizontally. And to center this in the container, I'll just widen the text object until it touches the container's borders. And now that we have the breakdown of work arrangement types, I also want to take a deeper look and look at the locations of the employees. For this, I'm going to create a new worksheet and keep on the theme with hexagons by doing a hex map. Building a hexagon map in Tableau is actually easier than I thought. First, I need to click on the employee data source. Then I'll go to the data source tab and add a connection. I'll choose this spatial file and use this file that I have linked in the description. And there's 2 options in here, a padded and a non-padded version. For this, I'm going to use the non-padded version, but I'll show at the end what it looks like with the padded version. And instead of using a join to connect the data, I'm actually going to use a relationship. But first I'll show the problem with joining. When I join the employee data with the hex states data, an inner join could give us problems. Say I didn't have every single state in my data set. Then the hex map is going to look incomplete because there's going to be states missing. So if I want the complete set of states, say I do a right join. If I don't have every state in my employee data set, then it causes nulls, which we can work around, but it's annoying. So instead I'm going to do a relationship. I'll close out of this data source and pull the hex state file into the pane. Then at the bottom, I'm going to use the relationship to set location equals state. And now on the hex map worksheet, we can see the employee data and the hex states data. Building the hex map is super simple. Just pull latitude into the rows and longitude into the columns. Then pull the geometry field into the marks. And we don't want this background map because it's not set to the accurate coordinates. So I'm going to go to the Map tab at the top, choose Map Options, and uncheck all of these. That way users can't mess around with the functionality of it. Then to get rid of the background itself, I'll go to Map again and choose Background Layers. One option I've seen a lot of people do is set the washout to 100%, but if you want this on a non-white background, I think the better option is to keep the washout at 0 and just uncheck all the background map layers. That way we can put it against any background we want. To add in my employee data, in the marks, I'm going to type the count distinct of employee ID. Then I'll make this determine the color of the hexagon states. And I also need to pull in the state level detail. Then I can edit the colors using the legend and choose the color range to represent the number of employees in each state. So here I'm using a custom diverging palette and using white to represent fewer employees and dark gray to represent more employees. And then really quickly for formatting the worksheet, I'll go to Shading and choose None. For borders, I'll remove the row and column dividers. So now when I hover over State, you can see the state abbreviation and the number of employees in that state. And if you want it to be more descriptive, you can use the state field rather than the state abbreviation field. Now I'll go back to the dashboard to add our hex map worksheet. I'll hide the title of the worksheet and mess around with the positioning. Then I'm going to edit the title of the legend and rename it Active Employees. I'll center the text, change it to Tableau Regular, and lighten the color up. Then I'll position the legend in the empty space under our map. And I need a title for this visual, so I'm going to copy the work arrangement title, paste it, and then I'll edit the text to say location. And once I get all my objects in place, I'm going to show what this will look like with the padded version of the hexagon map. So I'm going to go to the Data Source tab and bring in the padded version of the file. Then I'll set up the relationship so that location equals state. And on the worksheet, I'm going to replace the red fields with the padded data source versions. Then you can edit the colors using the legend and choose any color palette you want. And you can even make your own. Going back to the dashboard with the non-padded version of the hexagon chart, I'm going to add the next series of visuals, which will be for the organization and function. And I'll start by looking at the organization and function by headcount. I'll make the subtitle a little bit smaller and a little bit lighter. Then on a new worksheet, I'll build a heat map matrix to show the number of people by organization and function. So I'll start by selecting the employee data source, and I'll bring organization into the columns and function into the rows. To generate a basic table, I'll type in the marks the count distinct of the employee IDs. Then I'll make this text. And I want to have full control over the background color of each table cell and the text color. So I need to type 0 into the columns twice to create two separate marks. Then I'll right-click on one of these to make it a dual access. One mark will be used for the customization of the background, and the other mark will be used for the customization of the text. So starting with the first mark, I'm going to change this to a shape. Then I'll remove the text so that we're left with just the shape. And under shapes, you can choose a square, but I'm going to make it a bit more polished by using a rounded corner container that I loaded in here. Since the second mark will be for the text, I'm going to change the mark type to text. And I'll create a calculated field to color the shapes in text based on whether the number of employees is high, low, or somewhere in the middle. And since we have organization and function in the view, I'm going to type if holding fixed the organization and function, the count distinct of the employee IDs is greater than 700, then return the text high. For the second condition, I'll copy the first line and paste it. Then I'll alter the condition to be less than 200, and make it output the text low. And everything else in between will be captured in the null values. Then I'll bring this calculated field into the second mark to determine the color of the text. And I'll do the same thing for the first mark, bringing the calculated field in to determine the color of the box. So that we can actually see the rounded corner containers, I'm going to increase the size. Then I'll edit the colors using the legend. I want high to stand out, so I'm going to make the color of the box for high a light blue. And I'll make the color of the text for high black. For low, I'm going to choose a gray color for the box and a dark gray color for the text. And for null, which represents the middle, I'm going to make this a lighter gray for the box. And I'll make the text the same dark gray as the low text. Color coding the boxes and text draws attention to the values you want users to focus on. To edit the text itself, I'll go to the second mark, go to Text, and Edit. And to make it more noticeable, I'll change the font to Tableau Regular. Using the size slider in the second mark, I can change the size of the text. And using the size slider in the first mark, I can change the size of the boxes. These headers work well, but I want to add a bit more detail. And you can do this by creating calculated fields. So I'll show two ways to enhance your headers. And I'll start with the organization header. I'll type holding fixed the organization, take the count distinct of the employee IDs. Then divide this by holding fixed nothing, take the count distinct of the employee IDs. This will give us the percent of employees within each organization. To customize how these percentages are displayed, I'll start by wrapping the calculation in the round function. And I'll round it to 2 decimal places. Then I'll multiply this by 100 to get a percentage. And I'll wrap this in the string function so that at the end I can add the text percent. Then I'll bring this new calculated field into the columns after the organization. And now we have a clearer view of how much each organization is contributing to the overall headcount. I'm also adding the organization category field to segment the data by the overall organization type. But I'll remove the header since we only need the segmentation, not the label. And I'll hide the field label for organization as well. So if I did the same thing for function that I did for the organization percent, we would get 2 separate fields. But I want the function text and the percent to be in the same field. It's going to have a similar structure to the organization percent, so I'm going to right-click to duplicate the field. Then I'll edit it for the function plus the percent. I'll start by changing the organization field in the calculation to function. Then at the very beginning, I'll add function plus and do the text dash. And this works well because we've already translated the percentage into a string. Now I'll bring our function plus the percent field in to replace the function field. Now when I drag it out, you can see we have it all within one field. I'm also going to hide the label because we don't need that. And I'll format this worksheet really quick. For shading, I'm going to choose none. And for borders, I'm going to remove the header. Then I'm going to make the pane a lighter color. And I'll do this for the column divider as well. I'll also take the level down for the column divider. And for lines, I'll remove the 0 lines. Then on the dashboard, I'll add our organization and function by headcount worksheet. I'll hide the title of the worksheet and resize this. And I want this to be set to the entire view. And after I get this positioned, I'm going to go to the Layout tab and bring the title in front of the worksheet. Then I'll copy and paste the title, and I'll edit the text to be by salary. To represent the organization and function by salary, I'll start with a visual that breaks down the organization category by the average salary. And I'm going to use some donut charts to build this visual. So I'm going to start by bringing in the organization category into the columns. Then I'll type 0 twice in the rows. For the first mark, I'm going to change this to a pie. I'll type the average salary and make this determine the angle of each slice of the pie. Then I'll bring in the function field and make this determine the color of each slice. For the second mark, I'm going to change this to a circle to get the donut effect. Then I'll right-click on one of our sum of zeros to make this a dual axis. And using the first mark, I'll increase the size of the pie. That way you can see it behind the circle. I'll also increase the size of the circle so that I have a thinner ring for my donut chart. And using color in the marks, I'll change this to white. Then I'll bring in the organization category field and make this a label. I'll also type the average of the salary and make this a label as well. Then I'll format the average salary so that the number is in a custom currency with no decimals, and in the thousands. Using label within the second mark, I'll edit the text. And I'll make the average salary Tableau medium and a little bit bigger. Then using the alignment, I'll center this horizontally and vertically. That way the text is centered within the donut chart. Using the legend, I'll edit the colors. And I'm just going to use a combination of blues and grays to color this donut chart by function. For formatting, I'll start by hiding the field label, and then removing all the headers. Then I'll format the worksheet, and for shading, I'll choose none. For borders, I'll remove the row and column dividers. And for lines, I'll remove the zero lines for the sheet, the grid lines for the rows, and I'm going to add grid lines for the columns. I'll just choose this light gray color because I want it to be subtle. Then on the dashboard, I'll go to the Dashboard tab so I can bring the Organization category worksheet on. I'll hide the title of the worksheet, and I can remove this legend because we have all this information within the visual. But there is some extra information in the tooltip, and I just wanted to capture the Organization category, the function, and the average salary. So I'm going to go back to the Organization category worksheet, and under the All Marks, I'll edit the tooltip, and I'll just remove these sum of zeros. That way the tooltip is clear what the slices of these donut charts represent. And now that we have the breakdown for overall category by average salary, I also want to look at it at a more detailed view by category and function. So on this new worksheet, I'm going to build a bar chart that looks at the organization and function by average salary. I'll start by moving organization category into the columns to get the proper segmentation. Then I'll pull organization next to it. In the rows, I'm going to type the average salary. Then I'll bring function into the marks and make this a color. And now we have a simple visual that breaks down the average salary by organization and function. For formatting, I'm going to start by removing all the headers except for the organization. Then I'll format the worksheet, and for shading, I'll choose none. For borders, I'm going to remove the row divider and remove the header for the column divider. But for the pane, I'm going to choose a light color. Then for lines, I'll remove the zero lines and the row grid lines. I'll also hide the organization field label. On the dashboard, I'll add our organization and function by salary worksheet. And again, we don't need the legend because the information's already in the tooltip. I'll hide the title of the worksheet and position this under our donut charts. And the bars are looking a bit thick, so I'm going to go back to the worksheet and decrease the size of the bars. There's a faint line that separates the organization bars by organization category, and a matching line between the organization category donut charts. I'm going to align these so that the bars for core are positioned to the left of the center line, and the bars for support are on the right. And after some refining, I'll move on to the next set of visuals, which will focus on employee demographics. I'll copy the subtitle so that I can edit the text, and I'll be starting with tenure by years of service. So I'll start off on a new worksheet to create a bar chart that shows tenure by years of service. And instead of using the service years field, which contains a wide range of numbers, I'll right-click on the field to create some bins. I'll make the size of the bins 5 years. Then I'll drag the service years bins into the rows. To create a normal bar chart, in the columns I would type the count distinct of employee IDs. But it's super easy to make these rounded, so I'm going to do so by moving measure values into the columns instead. Then in the measure values below, I'll type the count distinct of the employee IDs. And I'll also type a 0. Then I'll remove all the other ones and order these so that the sum of zeros first. Then for the mark type, I'll change this to a line. And I'll make measure names determine the path of the line. And when I increase the size of these bars, you can see that they're rounded. And instead of using these numbers to represent the bin ranges, I'm going to create a calculated field to customize how the ranges are displayed. I'll start by saying if any of the service years are less than 30, then holding fixed the service years bin, take the minimum of the service years. This will return the lowest number of service years within each bin. Then I'll wrap this in the string function. I'll add a dash. Then I'm going to copy our LOD and paste it. And this time I'll change min to the max. So if the bin currently in the view is displayed as 10, that's the lowest number, so it means greater or equal to 10 years and less than 15 years. So the minimum here would be 10 years and the maximum would be 14 years. And if it's not less than 30 years, I'm going to do the text 30 plus. So now I'll pull our formatted range formula into the rows. And you can see how 10 to 14 service years is a lot easier to understand than just 10. This makes the data easier to interpret, especially for users who aren't familiar with how bins work in Tableau. And because these are custom formatted ranges, you can adjust the formula to display them however you like. And we don't need the bins displayed anymore, so I'm going to remove the header. And I'll remove the value axis as well. Next, I'm going to segment these bars by gender. So I'll pull gender into the rows. And I'll apply a filter to keep only the two largest employee groups, female and male. Then I'll also pull gender into the marks and make this a color. Using the legend, I'll edit the colors. I'll assign female a light red color and male a light blue color. And now that we have these color-coded, we don't need the gender header anymore. I'll format the worksheet and start by making the alignment vertically centered. Then I'll make the text a little bit darker, and for shading, I'll choose none for the worksheet. For borders, I'll remove the row and column dividers. And for lines, I'll remove the 0 lines and the column grid lines. And I'm going to hide the field label because I already have a title for this visual on the dashboard. I'll also use color in the marks to decrease the opacity a little bit. Then on the dashboard, I'll bring in our tenure worksheet. I'll hide the title of the worksheet and set this to the entire view. Then I'll resize this visual under our title. The next demographic visual that I'll add is going to look at the number of employees by employment type and age. So on a new worksheet, I'm going to build a bar chart that shows the number of employees by age and employment type. So I'll start off by right-clicking on our age field to create some bins. And I'll make these size 5. Then I'll pull the age bins into the columns. In the rows, I'll type the count distinct of the employee IDs. Then I'll drag employment type into the marks and make this a color. I'll use the legend to edit the colors, and I'm just going to choose some blues and grays. Then I'll hide the field label and edit the access so that I can remove the access title. I'll also format the worksheet, and for shading, I'm going to remove the shading of the worksheet. For lines, I'll remove the 0 lines, the access rulers, and the row grid lines. Instead of creating custom formatted bins, I'm going to show how to edit the text for just one bin. So in this example, I want the 60 bin to say 60 plus. I'll right-click on the bin and hit Edit Alias. Now whatever I type in here will be displayed as the bin's text. On a dashboard, I'll add our age worksheet. And I'm going to remove this legend that it comes with, because instead I'm going to show how you can really customize any legend. To do this, I'm going to create a new worksheet for the type legend. I'll start by adding employee type to the rows. And in the columns, I'm going to type 0 3 times. But you can add as many zeros as you want to get as many marks as you need. For the first mark, I'm going to make this a circle. Then I'll add employee type and make it a label. I'll add employee type again to make it determine the color of the circle. That way they match the colors we have for the age bar chart. I'll type the count distinct of the employee IDs and make this a label as well. But I don't want these stacked on top of each other, so I'm going to go to label within the mark and edit it. And I'll make it the employee type, parentheses, the number of employees. I'll also lighten up the number so that it doesn't stand out as much, and darken the employee type so it does. For the second mark, I'll change the mark type to a shape. Then under shape, I'll hit more shapes and choose this rounded corner container that I loaded in here. Then I'll use the size slider to increase the size of the container. I'll move employee type into the mark and make this a color. That way it matches the color of the circles and our age bar chart. For the third mark, I'll change the mark type to text. I'll type the count distinct of the employee IDs and make this text. But we already have the number on here, so I'm going to right click on the field, go to Quick Table Calculation, and choose % of total. Then I'll right click on the field to format the number so that it's in a percentage with no decimals. I'll also move employee type into the marks and make it a color. And I don't want the text to be the same color as the container it's going to go in, so I'm going to drag measure names into the marks and make it a color as well. That way we get two separate legends, one for the circles and containers, and another for the text inside. To get the text inside, I'm going to right click on the sum of 0 and make it a dual access. Then I'll use the second legend to edit the colors of the text. And I'm just going to make these darker colors than the container they're in. To get these to stand out more, I'll edit the text and make it bold. And the text is still a little hard to read, so I'm going to edit the colors to make them a bit darker. For formatting, I'll start by removing the headers. Then I'll format the worksheet, and for shading, I'll choose none. For borders, I'll remove the row and column dividers. And for lines, I'll remove the 0 lines and the column grid lines. Then on a dashboard, I'll add our type legend. I'll remove the default legends and hide the title of the worksheet. Then I'll resize this legend above our bar chart. And I want this set to fill the entire view. But you can see the circles and the text are overlapping, so I'm going to go back to the type legend worksheet and right-click on the header to show it. For the left axis, I'm going to give this a custom range between -1 and 8. And this will effectively push all these visuals to the left. So when I go back to the dashboard, you can see they're no longer overlapping. But I also think the shapes are a little bit small, so I'm going to go back to the worksheet and just increase the size of all the shapes. And this is super nitpicky, but I feel like there should be a little bit more space between the circle and the text. So a workaround for adding that space is just to add a few spaces before the text. So now we have better spacing throughout our visual. And the last set of visuals I'll build for our demographics will be for the gender distribution. And typically I like to start off by building the main visual and then the legend. But because this legend will act as a visual itself, I'm going to start on a new worksheet to build the gender legend. And this is going to show a quick comparative summary of salary and workforce distribution across gender categories. So I'll start off by adding gender to the columns. That way the data in the view is segmented by gender. Then I'll type 0 into the rows twice. This first mark will be for the container holding all of the text and images. So I'm going to change the mark type to a shape. Then within shape, I'll hit more shapes, and I'll choose this elongated rounded corner container that I loaded in here. Then I'll pull gender into the mark and make it a color. That way each of our gender containers are a different color. I'll also make them big enough so we can put images and text in them. Then I'll use the legend to edit the colors. And I'm just going to change other to a gray color. Then I'll use color in the marks to decrease the opacity so that the stuff we put in will stand out more. This second mark is going to be for the text and images. So I'm going to change the mark type to a shape. Then I'll pull gender into the mark and make this determine the shape. Using shape within the marks, I'm going to edit the shapes. And I'm just going to choose these icons that I loaded in here. Then I'll move gender into the mark again to make it a label. And I'll type the average salary and make this a label as well. I'll also type the count distinct of the employee IDs, and I want to know the percentages. So I'm going to right click, go to quick table calculation, and choose percent of total. Then I'll change this to a label as well. To format these individual numbers, I'm going to right click format on the average salary first. For the number, I'm going to change this to a custom currency with no decimals in the thousands. And for the percents, I'm going to format this so that it's a percentage with no decimals. Then to design how the text is displayed, I'll use label within the marks and edit the text. I'm going to move gender first, then the average salary, then the percentage of employees. I'll make this whole thing centered in Tableau medium. Then I'll make gender bold so it stands out, and change the metrics to a smaller size. To get the images and text within the containers, I'll right-click on the sum of 0 and make this a dual axis. But you can see the images and text aren't centered within the containers. To position the images and text, I'll edit the axis. And I'll give this a custom range between -8 and 5. Since the negative number is bigger than the positive, it's going to move the image and text up. For formatting, I'll start by removing all the headers. Then I'll format the worksheet, and for shading, I'll choose none. For borders, I'll remove the row and column dividers. And for lines, I'll remove the 0 lines and the row grid lines. Then on the dashboard, I'll add our gender legend. We don't need these other legends, so I'm going to remove these. Then I'll hide the title of the worksheet and resize it. But you can see the text still isn't fitting within our box. To fix this, we can go back to the worksheet, show the header, and edit the axis. And we need to move these images and text up a little bit more. So I could type -10 in here, but instead I'm just going to do -2 to 1, since it's the same ratio as -10 to 5. Then I'll remove these headers, and back on our dashboard, our text and images are centered within our containers. Alternatively, you could also increase the size of the containers so that it fits everything in them. And the last visual for this dashboard will be a waffle chart showing the gender distribution. These are great for comparing group sizes at a glance. I already have a video that shows how to create a waffle chart using a 10 by 10 grid. And I explained in the video how to transform it to be 5 by 5. So in this, I'm going to do something a little bit different to show how to create one where the rows and the columns are not the same number. A basic waffle chart starts by adding a new data source. And I'm going to add that same Excel file that we've been using for all the visuals in this dashboard. Within this HR dataset, I have this sheet called Waffle Chart. This just has 2 fields in it, columns and rows, and they contain a combination of numbers. The columns go up to 7, and the rows only go to 5. On the worksheet, I'll start by moving column into the columns. Then I'll right-click to make it a dimension, and right-click again to make it discrete. I'll move row into the rows, right-click to make it a dimension, and right-click again to make it discrete. So you can see how it gives us a 5 by 7 grid. And we're not going to be joining this with the employee data, but instead calculating the percents using the employee data, and then referring to those calculations within the waffle chart data source. So I'll start by creating a calculated field to capture the percent of female employees. I'll start by saying if the gender equals female, then give me all the employee IDs. And I'll wrap this in the countDistinct function to get the total number of female employees. Then I'll divide this by the countDistinct of employee IDs, which is the total number of employees. I'll right-click on this field to duplicate it, and I'll edit the field to be for males. So I'll change the name of the field and the text in the formula as well. Then on the Waffle chart data source, I'll create a calculated field. This formula is going to categorize each square as female, male, or other based on their share of the total. And I'm going to go ahead and copy and paste this formula in here so I don't waste time typing it out. This is basically numbering each square from 1 to 35, then checking if the number falls within the range for female first, then male, and then assigns the rest to other. The 7s in this formula represent the number of columns in the grid. And when you multiply the columns and the rows, you get 35, which represents the total number of squares within the grid. The formula is in the description, so you can copy-paste it as is. And the only part you may need to adjust based on your grid size is the 7 and 35. So understanding how these numbers relate to the grid allows you to customize the waffle chart to any layout you want. I'll bring this field into the marks, set the mark type to a shape, and make the field determine the shape. Then I'll use the legend to edit the shapes, and I'll assign it some gender icons. Then using the size slider in the marks, I'll increase the size of the shapes. For formatting, I'll start by removing the headers. Then I'll format the worksheet, and for shading, I'll choose none. And for borders, I'll remove the row divider. Since the plus sign is not a custom shape, I can use color in the mark to change the color of the plus sign. Then on the dashboard, I'll enter gender waffle chart. I'll start by removing the default legend, then hide the title of the worksheet, and then resize it under the gender summary cards. And I also want to set this to the entire view. And now we have a complete HR dashboard that's clear, organized, and packed with insights. Now I'm going to show how to create the background in Canva in under 2 minutes. I like to start by clicking on the Elements icon and searching for something like gradient background to find some graphics. And for some reason I can't find the one I used for this dashboard, so I'm just going to go to Recently Used and add my image. Then I'll resize this so that fills the entire space of the canvas. Then using color, I'll change the overall color of the image. Next, I'll go to Elements and add a rounded corner container. These are super customizable. I'll start by making this fill almost the entire space of the canvas. Then I'll change the background color to white. And using transparency, I'll take the transparency down to like 30, 35. You can also use corner rounding to change how rounded the corners are. Next, I'll copy and paste this element and then resize it as part of my layout. I'll set the transparency to 100% so we get a white rounded box. Then I'll copy and paste this box to start making the layout of my dashboard. Then I'll copy and paste this box again, and this time I want it to overlap a little bit with my white box on the left. Then I'll change the color to gray, click the plus sign, and go to gradient. Then I'll resize the elements a little bit, and I'll go to the text icon on the left and add a text box. I'll type title and then move this to the top. I'll make the size of this bigger, align it to the left, and then make the font color white. For the font type, I'll change this to Lolita 1. And then using the effects, I'll do a lift effect and change the intensity to be lower. And now we have a super easy background created in Canva in minutes.